The first snows of winter had begun to dust the rooftops of Dust Hollow, Colorado territory, like flour sifted through God's own hands. It was late October 1883, and the wind that swept down from the mountains carried with it the promise of harder days ahead. Sarah Whitlow stood at the window of the small schoolhouse, watching the children bundle themselves against the cold as they headed home. Their laughter echoed off the weathered buildings before being swallowed by the vast emptiness that surrounded their little town. At 26, Sarah had already lived more life than many women twice her age. Her black mourning dress, worn faithfully for 3 years now, marked her as a widow. The townspeople had long since stopped expecting her to trade it for something brighter. They understood, in the way that only frontier folk could, that some griefs ran too deep to be measured by the passage of seasons. She closed the schoolhouse door and pulled her shawl tighter, making her way down the main street toward home. Dust Hollow wasn't much to look at, a collection of wood-frame buildings huddled together against the endless prairie, as if seeking comfort from each other. The church stood tallest among them, its white steeple a finger pointing accusingly at the gray sky. Father Brennan emerged from its doors as she passed, tipping his hat to her. "Evening service tomorrow, Sarah," he reminded her gently. "Will you lead the children's hymns?" "Of course, Father." Her voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone who had learned to keep their pain private. The priest had been her anchor these past 3 years, ever since Thomas had been crushed in the mine collapse. Without the church, without the routine of teaching and praying, she might have let the grief swallow her whole. Her small cabin sat at the edge of town, just before the land gave way to wilderness. Thomas had built it with his own hands in the first year of their marriage, promising her a bigger house once he struck it rich in the copper mines. Now it stood as a monument to dreams that would never be realized. She pushed open the door, grateful for the warmth from the stove she'd banked that morning, as she prepared her simple supper of beans and cornbread. Sarah heard the commotion from town, raised voices, the sound of horses, men shouting. Such disturbances weren't uncommon in Dust Hollow. Drifters passed through regularly, some looking for work, others running from something. But tonight felt different. There was an edge of fear in the voices that carried on the wind. She stepped onto her porch and saw a cluster of men gathered outside Morrison's general store. Even from this distance, she could see their agitation. Jake Morrison himself stood in the doorway, shotgun in hand. "Killed 3 men down in Pueblo." She caught the tail end of someone saying, "Sheriff Watson sent word. He's heading this way, tracking the Cutter Boys." The Cutter Boys. Sarah had heard the name whispered in the store, seen it on the wanted posters that occasionally made their way to Dust Hollow. Murderers and thieves who'd been terrorizing the territory for months. And now someone was hunting them. "Bounty hunter," another man spat, as if the words tasted foul. "No better than the men he hunts. If you ask me, they say he don't even speak. Just rides into town, finds his quarry, and leaves bodies behind." Sarah retreated into her cabin, bolting the door behind her. She had no love for violence, had seen enough of death to last a lifetime. Let the men with guns sort out their bloody business. She would pray for them all, the hunters and the hunted alike, but she would not watch. The night grew colder, and she built up the fire, settling into her chair with her Bible. The familiar words of the Psalms usually brought comfort, but tonight her mind kept drifting to the window, to the darkness beyond. Something felt different about this night, as if the very air had changed, charged with electricity like before a storm. It was near midnight when she heard it, the slow, measured clip-clop of hooves on the frozen ground. A single rider, moving without haste. The sound stopped somewhere near her cabin, and Sarah's heart began to pound. She clutched her Bible tighter, listening. Then came the crash, like something heavy falling against wood, a grunt of pain, barely human. Silence. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats. 100, 200. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind rattling her windows. Finally, she crept to the window and peered out into the moonlit yard. A horse stood there, reins trailing, steam rising from its flanks, and beside it, A dark shape sprawled in the dirt. A man, by the size of him, not moving. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to wait for morning when others could deal with whatever tragedy had been deposited on her doorstep. But then the shape moved, just slightly, and she heard that sound again, a low, animal grunt of pain. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, and went to get her medicine box. The man was even larger up close, his long duster coat dark with what could only be blood. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, knocked askew in his fall. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" He stirred, and faster than she could react. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, not painfully, but firm. She gasped, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were gray as winter sky, cold and distant, but beneath the ice she saw something else, pain. Not just from his wounds, but something deeper, older. He studied her face for a long moment. Then his grip loosened and his hand fell away. He tried to sit up, failed, and she saw fresh blood seep through his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, stating the obvious. "I need to get you inside." He shook his head once, sharply. His free hand moved to the gun at his hip. "I'm not going to hurt you," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "But you'll die out here if I don't help. Whatever you're running from, it can wait until morning." Something in her words seemed to reach him. He looked at her again, that penetrating stare that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. Then, slowly, he nodded. Getting him inside was a struggle. He was heavy, and though he tried to help, his strength was failing. She managed to half drag, half carry him to her bed, the same bed where Thomas had died. She realized with a pang, but there was no time for grief now. By lamplight, she could see the extent of his injuries. A bullet wound in his left shoulder, another graze along his ribs. His coat and shirt were ruined, and she had to cut them away. His chest was a map of old scars, telling stories of violence she couldn't imagine. She worked in silence, cleaning and binding his wounds. He never made a sound, though she knew the carbolic must burn terribly. His eyes tracked her movements, watchful even in his weakness. "I'm Sarah," she said finally, needing to fill the heavy quiet. "Sarah Whitlow. I teach at the school." He didn't respond, didn't offer his own name. She hadn't expected him to. Somehow, when she finished, she brought him water. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something unnerving about that steady gaze, but also something else, a recognition, perhaps, as if he too felt the strange electricity in the air between them. "You can rest here tonight," she said, gathering up the bloody bandages. "I'll sleep in the chair." His hand caught hers again, gentler this time. He shook his head, pointed to the door. "You want to leave? You can barely stand." He pointed again, more insistently. Understanding dawned. "You want me to lock it? In case they come looking." A single nod. She went to the door, sliding the heavy bolt home. When she turned back, his eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. Asleep, or trusting her enough to pretend. Sarah settled into Thomas's old chair by the fire, her Bible open on her lap. But she couldn't focus on the words. Her eyes kept drifting to the stranger in her bed, to the rise and fall of his bandaged chest. Who was this man, the bounty hunter the townspeople had spoken of with such fear? She thought she should be afraid. A dangerous man, wounded and desperate, alone with her in her cabin. But she felt no fear, only a strange sense of inevitability, as if God himself had delivered this man to her door, for reasons she couldn't yet understand. The wind howled outside, and snow began to fall in earnest. Whatever tomorrow would bring, tonight she would keep watch over this stranger. It was the Christian thing to do, she told herself. But as she studied his face in the firelight, younger than she'd first thought, beneath the trail dust and blood, she wondered if her motives were as pure as she pretended. "Lord," she whispered, "what have you brought to my door?" The only answer was the crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of the man who had already, in the space of an hour, made her feel more alive than she had in 3 long years. Dawn came slowly to Dust Hollow, the pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Sarah woke stiff from her night in the chair, her Bible still open across her lap. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed it all. The stranger, the blood, the strange pull she'd felt. Then she saw him, still in her bed, and her heart began its now familiar racing. He was awake, watching her with those gray eyes. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw roughened by several days' growth of beard. Younger than she'd thought, perhaps only a few years older than herself. Handsome, in a hard, weathered way that spoke of too many nights under open sky and too many mornings waking to danger. "Good morning," she said softly, standing and smoothing her skirts. "How do you feel?" He tried to sit up, winced, but managed it on the second attempt. His eyes went to the window, checking the yard beyond, then back to her. A slight nod, better, perhaps, or simply acknowledging her question. Sarah busied herself with breakfast, acutely aware of his presence in her small space. She'd lived alone for 3 years, had grown accustomed to the solitude. Now the cabin felt too small, too intimate. She could hear every shift of his body on the bed, every careful breath. She brought him coffee and biscuits, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. He ate slowly, methodically, his movements careful and controlled despite his injuries. When he finished, he pointed to his saddlebags, which she'd brought in the night before. Inside, she found a roll of bills, which he pressed into her hand. She tried to refuse, but his look was insistent. There was also a clean shirt, which she helped him into, trying not to notice the heat of his skin under her fingers or the way his muscles tensed at her touch. "I should check your wounds," she said, her voice coming out breathier than intended. He shook his head, pointed to the door. "Time to go. You can't ride like this. You'll tear open the stitches." His jaw tightened, but he didn't move toward the door. They stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Finally, he looked away first, settling back against the pillows, conceding. For now. The day passed in strange domesticity. Sarah went about her usual tasks, mending, reading, preparing meals, while he rested. Sometimes she felt his eyes on her, tracking her movements around the cabin. When she looked back, he never looked away, just held her gaze until she was the one to break it. Flustered and warm. By afternoon, word had come to town. The Cutter boys had been found dead on the road to Silver Creek. All 3 of them. Shot clean, professional. The bounty hunter had collected his due and disappeared. Except Sarah knew he hadn't disappeared. He was in her bed, drinking her coffee, filling her home with his silent presence. She should have been disturbed by the knowledge that this man had killed 3 people just hours before appearing at her door. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as he cleaned his pistol with practiced efficiency. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles, but gentle in their movements. Hands that had dealt death, yes, but also hands that had touched her with surprising care. "I was married," she found herself saying as she prepared supper. He looked up from his weapon, giving her his full attention. "Thomas, we came out here 5 years ago, full of dreams. He was going to make us rich in the copper mines." She stirred the pot of stew, remembering. "The mine collapsed 3 years ago, buried him and 12 others. They never even recovered the bodies." She didn't know why she was telling him this. Perhaps because he couldn't respond, couldn't offer the empty platitudes she'd heard so many times. Or perhaps because the way he listened, intent, focused, made her feel heard in a way she hadn't in years. "Father Brennan says it was God's will, that Thomas is in a better place now. I believe that. I do. But sometimes," she trailed off, surprised to feel tears on her cheeks. "Sometimes I'm so angry. At God, at Thomas for leaving me, at myself for still being here." She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed. But when she looked at him, there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. understanding, recognition, as if he knew exactly what it meant to be angry at the dead. He stood then, moving carefully, and crossed to where she stood by the stove. For a moment they just looked at each other, the space between them charged with possibility. Then he reached up, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a remaining tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was light as a feather, but it sent lightning through her entire body. She gasped, her lips parting, and saw his eyes darken in response. His hand lingered, cupping her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the warmth of his palm. Then he stepped back, returning to the bed, leaving her trembling and confused. She served supper in silence, both of them careful not to touch as she handed him his bowl. But the awareness was there, humming between them like a telegraph wire. That night, she insisted he keep the bed while she took the chair again, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay awake, watching the fire die to embers, intensely aware of every sound he made. When she finally dozed, she dreamed of gray eyes and gentle hands, of touches that went beyond that single, burning caress. She woke to find him standing by the window, fully dressed, his gun belt strapped on. The morning sun outlined his profile, and her heart sank. He was leaving. "Your wounds," she began, but he turned to her, shaking his head. He crossed to where she sat, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an old silver dollar, worn smooth with handling, and placed it on the table beside her. His eyes held hers for a long moment, saying things his voice couldn't or wouldn't. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Something else. Something deeper that she didn't dare name." Then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him. Sarah sat frozen, listening to his footsteps on the porch, the creak of leather as he mounted his horse, the slow fade of hoofbeats. She picked up the silver dollar, still warm from his hand. It was no ordinary coin. There were initials carved into it, worn but still visible. E.G. His initials? A token of some kind. The cabin felt empty, too quiet. She tried to return to her routine, but everything felt wrong. The bed still smelled of him, leather and gunpowder, and something uniquely male. His coffee cup sat on the table, the impression of his lips still on the rim. That night, she lay in her bed for the first time in 3 years. She told herself it was because the chair made her back ache, but as she pressed her face into the pillow where his head had rested, she knew she was lying. She dreamed of him that night, dreamed he hadn't left, that when he'd touched her face, he'd kept touching her, that his silent mouth had found hers in the firelight. She dreamed of his weight beside her in the bed, of scarred hands moving over her skin with the same gentle precision he'd used to clean his gun. She woke gasping, her body aching with need she'd thought buried with Thomas. Shame flooded her, followed quickly by confusion. How could a man she'd known for 2 days, a man who hadn't spoken a single word, affect her so deeply? Sarah rose and went to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where he'd fallen that first night. In the sunrise, she thought she could still see the impression of his body, already being filled in by fresh snow. Soon there would be no trace of him at all, except for the silver dollar, except for the way her skin still burned where he'd touched her, except for the hollow ache in her chest that told her nothing would ever be the same. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, watching her breath fog the window. "God help me," she whispered, because she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that if Elias Granger ever came back to Dust Hollow, she wouldn't have the strength to let him leave again. Winter settled over Dust Hollow like a heavy blanket, and with it came a restlessness Sarah couldn't shake. She went through her days mechanically, teaching the children their letters, leading hymns on Sunday, visiting the sick with Father Brennan. But her thoughts constantly strayed to a pair of gray eyes and a silver dollar she kept hidden in her bureau drawer. Then, 3 weeks after he'd left, she saw him again. She was at Morrison's store, purchasing flour and salt, when she felt that familiar prickle at the back of her neck. She turned, and there he was, standing near the door like a shadow made solid. He'd taken a room at Mrs. Henley's boarding house. She learned from the whispered gossip, paid a week in advance, kept to himself, occasionally helped Walt Jensen at the smithy. Their eyes met across the store. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so small others might have missed it. But Sarah felt it like a physical touch, her whole body responding to that simple acknowledgement. She began to see him around town after that, always at a distance, always watchful. When she walked to school in the mornings, she might glimpse him by the smithy. When she left church on Sundays, he'd be across the street, leaning against a post, never approaching, never speaking, just there. The children noticed him too, whispering stories they'd heard from their parents. How he'd killed a man in Tombstone, how he'd tracked outlaws through blizzards that would kill normal men, how he never spoke because he'd taken a vow of silence after murdering his own brother. "That ain't true," young Mary Morrison piped up one day. "My PA says he got his throat cut by Apaches. That's why he can't talk. My mama says he sold his voice to the devil for the power to never miss a shot." Timothy Banks countered. Sarah silenced them with a sharp look, but their words lingered. Who was Elias Granger? Really? What had carved those lines around his eyes? Put that careful control in every movement? The answer came unexpectedly on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had taken the path through the woods to gather kindling, her old mare placid beneath her. The ice-covered creek gurgled nearby, and she dismounted to let the horse drink. That's when it happened. A rabbit burst from the underbrush, startling the mare. The horse reared, and Sarah, caught off guard, felt herself flying backward. The world tilted, and she hit the edge of the creek hard, her ankle twisting beneath her as she tumbled into the shallow, icy water. The cold knocked the breath from her lungs. She struggled to stand, but her ankles screamed in protest, and the current, though shallow, was stronger than it looked. Panic clawed at her throat as her heavy skirts dragged her down. Then strong hands were hauling her up, out of the water and onto the bank. Elias, of course it was Elias. He gathered her against him, his coat warm around her shaking form. My horse," she managed through chattering teeth. He made a low sound in his throat, not quite a word, but she understood. The horse would be fine. She was what mattered. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to his own mount. She should protest, she knew. Being held like this, pressed against his chest, it wasn't proper, but she was so cold, and he was so warm, and her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. He settled her sideways on his saddle and swung up behind her, one arm secure around her waist. She had no choice but to lean back against him, feeling the solid wall of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. He clicked to the horse and they moved off, leaving her mare to find her own way home. The ride back to her cabin passed in a blur of sensation. The rhythm of the horse, the circle of his arm, the way his breath stirred her hair. By the time they arrived, she was no longer shaking from cold, but from something else entirely. He carried her inside, settling her in the chair by the fire. His hands were gentle as he removed her wet boots, examining her swollen ankle. When he looked up at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded. He needed to remove her stockings to properly check the injury. Sarah bit her lip as his fingers worked at the fastening below her knee. This was beyond improper now, scandalous, even, but there was nothing untoward in his touch, only careful concern as he peeled the wet wool away. His hands on her bare skin were warm, calloused, infinitely careful as he probed the swelling. Not broken, his expression seemed to say. He rose and went to her kitchen, returning with snow wrapped in a cloth for the swelling. As he knelt before her again, pressing the compress to her ankle, Sarah found herself studying the top of his head. His hair was dark brown, with hints of auburn in the firelight. Without thinking, she reached out and touched it. He went very still. Slowly, he raised his head, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Hunger. Raw, desperate hunger that matched the ache in her own chest. "I dream about you," she whispered. The confession pulled from her without her permission. "Every night since you left. Is that wicked of me?" He reached up and caught her hand, pressing it flat against his cheek. His eyes closed, and she felt him tremble. This man who faced down killers without flinching, trembling at her touch. When his eyes opened again, they were dark with emotion. He shook his head slowly, not wicked. His free hand rose to her face, mirroring her own gesture, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. The question in his eyes was clear. "Yes," she breathed. "I feel it too, whatever this is between us." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. But she didn't want to pull away. She wanted to fall into him, to drown in the storm she saw in his eyes. Their lips met, soft at first, almost hesitant. Then Sarah made a small sound in her throat, and his control shattered. He surged up, pulling her against him, and the kiss became something desperate, hungry. 3 years of loneliness, of grief, of emptiness poured out of her and into him. His arms came around her, crushing her to his chest, and she could feel his heart hammering against her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. She touched her lips, still feeling the burn of his mouth. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." But he was already pulling back, that careful control sliding back into place. He stood, stepping away from her, and she saw the war in his face. Want battling with something else? Conscience, fear. He shook his head, backing toward the door. Elias. His name on her lips made him freeze. "I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking for tonight." For a moment, she thought he might give in. His hands clenched at his sides, his whole body taut with tension. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. Sarah sat in the chair, her ankle throbbing, her lips swollen from his kiss, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. She'd offered herself to a man who wasn't her husband, a man with blood on his hands and violence in his past, and instead of shame, all she felt was the ache of his absence. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks he'd left, but Sarah knew he hadn't gone far. She could feel him out there in the darkness, watching, waiting, fighting the same battle she was losing. She touched the silver dollar in her pocket, running her finger over the worn initials. E.G. Elias Granger, a man of silence and shadows, of gentle hands and desperate kisses. A man who made her feel alive in ways that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Father Brennan would tell her to pray, to ask God to remove this temptation from her path. But as Sarah sat in the firelight, her body still humming from Elias's touch, she found she couldn't form the words, because for the first time in 3 years, she wanted something for herself, something that had nothing to do with duty or grief or the expectations of others. She wanted Elias Granger, and God help her, she was going to have him. The days following their kiss were torture. Sarah saw Elias around town, but he kept his distance, never coming close enough to speak. Not that he would have spoken anyway. She threw herself into her work, teaching with a fervor that surprised her students, praying with an intensity that worried Father Brennan. "You seem troubled, child," the priest said after Sunday service, his kind eyes searching her face. "Is there something you wish to confess?" Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her lips, remembering. "No, Father, nothing to confess." But that was a lie, wasn't it? She had sinned in her heart 1,000 times since that night, reliving that kiss, imagining more. At night, she lay in bed and burned with shame and desire in equal measure. The whispers started slowly. "Mrs." Henley mentioned to Mrs. Morrison that the bounty hunter had been seen near the Whitlow cabin. "Mrs." Morrison told Mrs. Banks, who told her husband, who mentioned it at the saloon. Soon, the whole town knew that Sarah Whitlow had been alone with that dangerous man. "Ain't proper," she heard Jake Morrison mutter when she entered the store. Woman living alone, entertaining strange men, her poor husband barely cold in the ground. 3 years cold, his wife corrected, but her eyes were just as judging when they fell on Sarah. Sarah held her head high, purchased her goods, and left without a word. But inside, doubt gnawed at her. Was she dishonoring Thomas's memory? Was this pull she felt toward Elias just loneliness disguised as something else? The answer came the following Wednesday. Sarah was at the blackboard, teaching arithmetic, when she heard the commotion outside. Horses, several of them, riding hard into town. Through the window, she saw 4 men dismounting in front of the saloon. Rough-looking men, armed to the teeth, with the kind of faces that had seen too much violence and liked it. "Miss Sarah?" Little Mary Morrison tugged at her skirt. "Who are those men?" Before Sarah could answer, the schoolhouse door burst open. Elias stood there, his face tight with urgency. He jerked his head. "Get the children down, now!" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Everyone under your desks," she commanded. "We're going to play a game. Who can be the most quiet?" The children, sensing the seriousness in her tone, scrambled to obey. Elias crossed to the window, peering out carefully. Sarah joined him, her heart hammering. "Who are they?" she whispered. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes. Not for himself, she realized. For her. For the children. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it with shaking hands. A wanted poster. Her own face stared back at her. No, not quite her face. Similar enough to be a sister, perhaps. Same dark hair, same fine features. "Sarah Dalton," she read. "Wanted for the murder of Judge Harold Whitman. $500 reward." She looked at Elias in confusion. "This isn't me. I'm not—" He pressed a finger to her lips, shaking his head. It didn't matter. These men wouldn't ask questions first. They'd shoot, collect their bounty, and be gone before anyone could prove they'd killed the wrong woman. Gunshots erupted outside. Sarah flinched, and Elias pulled her down, shielding her with his body. The children whimpered under their desks. "The sheriff," Sarah began, but Elias shook his head grimly. Dust Hollow's sheriff was 70 years old and half blind. He'd be no match for these men. More gunshots. A woman's scream. The sound of breaking glass. The bounty hunters were tearing the town apart, looking for their prize. Elias made a decision. He guided Sarah to the back of the schoolhouse, where a small storage room offered the only hiding place. He pushed her inside, then turned to face the door, drawing his gun. "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't leave me." He cupped her face in his free hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. His eyes said everything his voice couldn't. "I'll protect you. I'll die before I let them hurt you." Then he was gone, closing the door behind him. Sarah pressed her eye to a crack in the wood, watching as he positioned himself between the children and the door. They didn't have long to wait. The schoolhouse door slammed open, and 2 of the bounty hunters entered, guns drawn. "Where is she?" one demanded. "Sarah Dalton. We know she's here." Elias remained silent, his gun steady. "You're that bounty hunter," the second man said. "Granger. Heard about you. This ain't your bounty, friend. Walk away." Elias shook his head once. The first man laughed, ugly and harsh. "Protecting her, are you, sweet on the murderous bitch? Step aside, or we'll go through you." Sarah saw Elias's jaw tighten. His gun never wavered. "Have it your way." The bounty hunter snarled, raising his weapon. The schoolhouse erupted in violence. Elias moved faster than Sarah would have thought possible, firing twice before diving for cover. One bounty hunter fell immediately. The other scrambled behind a desk, cursing. "He's just one man," the wounded hunter shouted out the door. "Get in here!" The other 2 burst in, and suddenly Elias was outnumbered 3 to 1. Sarah watched in terror as he fought with a desperate efficiency, using desks for cover, never wasting a shot. But there were too many, and they were spreading out, trying to flank him. Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. She burst from the storage room, grabbing a heavy bookend from the teacher's desk. The nearest bounty hunter turned at the movement, his gun swinging toward her. Time slowed. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw death in his eyes. Then Elias was there, throwing himself between them. The gun fired, and Elias staggered, blood blooming across his shirt, but his own gun was already rising, and his shot was true. The bounty hunter crumpled. The remaining two fled, apparently deciding that no bounty was worth this carnage. Sarah caught Elias as he fell, easing him to the floor. Blood was spreading too fast, too much. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hands to the wound. "Don't you dare die on me." He reached up with a shaking hand, touching her face. His lips moved, and for the first time, she heard his voice, rough, damaged, barely a whisper. "Worth it." "Help!" Sarah screamed. "Someone help!" People poured in. Father Brennan, Doc Hartley, half the town. They carried Elias to the doctor's office, Sarah refusing to leave his side, as Doc Hartley worked to remove the bullet. Sarah held Elias's hand and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. "Please, God," she whispered. "I know I have no right to ask. I know I've sinned in my heart, but please, don't take him. Not when I've just found him." Hours passed. The bullet came out. The bleeding stopped. But Elias burned with fever. Sarah stayed by his bedside, cooling his face with damp cloths, holding his hand through the worst of it. Father Brennan came to her on the second day. "Sarah," he said gently, "you need to rest. Let others tend to him." "No." Her voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "I'm not leaving him." "Child," the priest's voice grew stern, "this man is not your husband. It isn't proper." "Proper?" Sarah laughed, wild and bitter. "He took a bullet for me. Father, he saved my life, the children's lives. I don't care what's proper anymore." Father Brennan studied her for a long moment. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes, God help me, yes." The priest sighed, looking older than his years. "Love itself is not a sin. Sarah, but be careful. This path you're choosing, it won't be easy." "I know," Sarah whispered, looking down at Elias's pale face. "But I choose it anyway." On the third night, the fever broke. Elias opened his eyes, focusing on Sarah's face with an obvious relief. He tried to speak, winced, and touched his throat. "Shh," Sarah soothed. "Don't try to talk. Your voice. The doctor said your throat was damaged worse by the strain. You need to heal." He squeezed her hand, his eyes saying what his voice couldn't. "You're safe, that's all that matters." Sarah leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "You beautiful, foolish man," she whispered. "Don't ever scare me like that again." His hand came up to tangle in her hair, holding her there, and in that moment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that her life was forever entwined with this silent guardian who'd been willing to die for her. Whatever the town thought, whatever Father Brennan or God himself might say, she belonged to Elias Granger now, and he belonged to her. The weeks following the shooting passed in a strange bubble of quiet intimacy. Elias recovered slowly, first at Doc Hartley's. Then, despite the scandalized whispers, at Sarah's cabin, she'd stood firm against all objections, even Father Brennan's gentle warnings. "He has no one else," she'd said simply, "and I won't abandon him." So Elias returned to her small home, to the bed where he'd first lain wounded. Sarah tended him with a dedication that went beyond mere Christian charity, and everyone in town knew it. She could feel their eyes on her when she went to market, heard the whispers that followed in her wake. "Shameless, Mrs." Henley hissed to her circle of friends. "Acting like a wife when she's nothing but a Christian woman tending to a man who saved her life." Father Brennan interrupted firmly, having overheard, but even his defense couldn't stop the talk. Sarah found she cared less with each passing day. Let them whisper. They hadn't seen Elias throw himself between her and death. They didn't know the gentleness in his damaged voice when he managed to whisper her name in the dark hours before dawn. Those quiet moments sustained her through the difficult days. Elias's voice remained a broken whisper, painful for him to use. But in the stillness of evening, with just the fire crackling between them, he would sometimes speak. Sarah, just her name, rough and soft at once. like gravel wrapped in velvet. "I'm here," she would answer, and he would reach for her hand, holding it like an anchor. One evening, as she helped him with the exercises Doc Hartley had prescribed to regain his strength, Elias caught her wrist. His gray eyes were intense, almost fevered. "Need to tell you," he rasped. "Shh." She pressed fingers to his lips. "You don't need to strain." He shook his head impatiently, catching her hand. "Listen." The word came out harsh, desperate. "My past. You should know." And so, in broken whispers over the course of several nights, Elias told her his story. He'd been a lawman once, a deputy marshal in Kansas, had a wife, Rebecca, and a daughter. His voice broke entirely when he spoke of them, and Sarah had to lean close to hear. "Corrupt judge, land scheme." The words came in fragments. "I was investigating. They killed them. Rebecca, Lucy. She was only 4. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She could see it now, the depth of pain in his eyes, the weight he carried in every movement. "Killed the men responsible," he continued, his damaged voice emotionless now. "All of them. Judge, his men, became what I am, hunter. Nothing left but the hunt. Until now," Sarah whispered. He looked at her, and she saw wonder in his eyes. "Until now," he agreed. That night, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved. When Sarah brought him his evening meal, instead of returning to her chair, she sat on the edge of the bed. Elias's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are," she said quietly. "But I am asking you to be careful, to come back, always come back." He tugged her hand, gentle but insistent, until she leaned down. His kiss was soft, reverent, a promise sealed without words. When they parted, Sarah's cheeks were wet with tears. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. "Just stay." He shifted over, making room for her on the narrow bed. Sarah knew she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Tomorrow, the town would know. Her reputation, already tattered, would be in ruins. But as she settled against Elias's warmth, feeling his arm come around her, she found she didn't care. They lay together fully clothed, chaste but intimate. Sarah listened to his breathing, felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. For the first time in years, the empty ache inside her eased. Just before dawn, she woke to find him watching her, his eyes soft in the pale light. "Beautiful," he whispered, the single word costing him obvious pain. Sarah kissed him, pouring all her love into the gesture. "So are you," she murmured against his lips. The sun rose on a new scandal. Mrs. Henley, arriving early with soup she claimed was for the invalid, saw Sarah emerging from the bedroom in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. The older woman's shriek could probably be heard in the next county. By noon, Sarah had been summoned to the church. She found not just Father Brennan waiting, but half the town council, including Mayor Hutchins and several prominent wives. "This has gone far enough," the mayor declared. "You're a teacher, Mrs. Whitlow. You have a responsibility to set a moral example for our children." "I've set an example of compassion," Sarah replied, her chin high, "of caring for someone who needed help. You've set an example of wanton behavior." "Mrs. Morrison spat. "Taking that killer into your bed. I've taken no one to my bed in the way you're implying," Sarah interrupted, though she knew the technicality meant little. "Mr. Granger saved my life. He saved your daughter's life, Mrs. Morrison. All of the children in that schoolhouse owe their lives to him. That doesn't give you the right to live in sin." "Mrs. Banks cried. Father Brennan raised a hand for silence. "Sarah," he said gently, "no one is denying what Mr. Granger did, but surely you can see how your arrangement appears. You're not married. It isn't proper for him to stay with you." "Then I'll marry him," Sarah said, the words coming out before she'd even thought them through. The room erupted in shocked gasps. "The man's a killer," Mayor Hutchins blustered. "A hired gun." "The man's a hero," Sarah shot back. "And I love him." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Brennan studied her with sad eyes. "And does he love you?" the priest asked quietly. Sarah thought of gray eyes soft in the dawn light, of broken whispers of her name, of a man willing to die to keep her safe. "Yes," she said with complete certainty. "He does." "Then bring him to me," Father Brennan said, ignoring the outraged sputters around him. "If you're determined to do this, at least let it be with God's blessing." Sarah left the church with her head high, but inside, her heart was racing. Marriage. She'd spoken without thinking, but now the idea took root. Could Elias even want that? A life with her, in this small town that barely tolerated him? She found him sitting on the porch when she returned, his gun in pieces on the small table as he cleaned it. He looked up at her approach, and she saw he already knew. News traveled fast in Dust Hollow. "I'm sorry," she began, but he shook his head, setting aside the gun parts. He stood, still moving carefully, and cupped her face in his hands. "Marry me?" The two words came out rough, broken, but clear. Sarah laughed through sudden tears. "I was supposed to ask you that." He kissed her, deep and sure, and she had her answer. When they parted, she saw Jake Morrison watching from across the street, his face twisted with something ugly. He'd been one of the men who'd shown interest after Thomas died, and she'd politely declined. Now his eyes promised trouble. "Let them talk," she said, following Elias's gaze. "I choose you." "I choose us." That night, as they lay together in the narrow bed, still chaste, still clothed, but closer than ever, Sarah felt the first stirrings of real fear, not of the town's judgment, not even of Elias's dangerous profession, but of the depth of her own feeling, of how completely she'd given herself to this man of few words and many scars. "Don't leave me," she whispered in the darkness. His arms tightened around her, and she felt his damaged voice rumble through his chest. "Never." It was a promise she desperately wanted to believe, but outside, the wind howled like a warning, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their hardest tests were yet to come. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a writer who didn't stop for pleasantries. Sarah watched from the window as Elias read it, saw the way his shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened. When he looked up at her, she knew their peaceful days were over. He handed her the letter. It was from a marshal's office in Denver, offering a significant bounty for 3 men. The Colton Gang. Murder, robbery, assault. The list of crimes was extensive. The reward, substantial. "You don't have to go," Sarah said, though she knew better. Elias touched her face gently, his eyes saying what his damaged voice couldn't easily express. This was who he was, what he did, and these men. The letter mentioned they'd killed a family, 2 children among the dead. "I understand," Sarah whispered. And she did. The same drive that had led him to avenge his own family wouldn't let him ignore this. "When?" "Tomorrow," he rasped. That night, they lay together, and Sarah memorized everything. The weight of his arm around her, the sound of his breathing, the way his heartbeat felt beneath her palm. Neither of them slept. In the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah helped him prepare. His guns, cleaned and loaded. Ammunition, food for the trail. She moved mechanically, trying not to think about the fact that he might not return. At the door, Elias pulled her close, kissing her with a desperation that made her knees weak. When they parted, he pressed something into her hand, a simple gold ring. "When I return," he whispered, each word an effort. "Marry me, then?" Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, of course." Then he was gone, swallowed by the morning mist, and Sarah was left alone with her fears. The days that followed were agony. Sarah tried to maintain normalcy, teaching school, attending church, keeping house, but everywhere she went, she felt the weight of judgment and speculation. The ring on her finger drew stares and whispers. "Engaged to a killer." She heard Mrs. Henley say, Mark my words, she'll be a widow twice over before she's 30. It was Jake Morrison who brought real trouble. He cornered her outside the schoolhouse one afternoon, whiskey strong on his breath. "You made a mistake," he said, standing too close. "Choosing him over decent folk, over me. Please move aside. Mr. Morrison," Sarah said calmly, though her heart was racing. "He's not coming back," Jake continued, his hand catching her arm. "Men like him don't come back, and when he's dead, you'll need someone to take care of you. I'm willing to overlook your indiscretions." Sarah wrenched her arm free. "Elias will return, and even if he didn't, I would never—" Jake's face darkened. "You think you're too good for me? Who's been warming a killer's bed?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah straightened her spine. "What Elias and I have is blessed by God and Father Brennan. Can you say the same for your thoughts, Mr. Morrison?" She pushed past him, but his parting words followed her. "When he's dead, you'll have no one else. Remember that." 2 weeks passed, then 3. The town began to look at her with pity rather than scandal. Poor Sarah Whitlow, abandoned by her outlaw lover. Foolish woman, believing a man like that could change. Only Father Brennan offered comfort. "Faith, child," he said after Sunday service. "Have faith." But faith was hard to maintain when the nights were so long and empty. When every hoofbeat on the street made her heart leap only to fall again when it wasn't him. Then came the night when Jake Morrison's prophecy nearly came true. Sarah woke to the sound of horses, many of them, riding hard into town. She peered out her window and her blood ran cold. 5 men, armed and dangerous looking. At their head rode someone she recognized from wanted posters, Bill Colton himself. They were asking questions at the saloon, their voices carrying on the night air. Looking for Elias Granger. Looking for the woman he kept. Sarah's hands shook as she loaded Thomas's old shotgun. She knew why they'd come. Elias must have killed some of their gang. Now they wanted revenge, and they'd use her to get it. The pounding on her door came sooner than expected. "Open up," a rough voice demanded. "We know you're in there." Sarah stood in her nightgown, shotgun raised, and called back, "I'll shoot the first man through that door." Cruel laughter. "Feisty one, ain't she? Granger likes them spirited. Come on out, woman. You're gonna help us send him a message." "Go to hell." The door exploded inward with a crash. Sarah fired, catching one man in the shoulder, but there were too many. Rough hands seized her, wrenching the gun away. Bill Colton himself backhanded her, sending her sprawling. "Tie her up," he ordered. "We'll wait for Granger to come home to his woman. Then we'll show him what happens when you hunt the Colton gang." They dragged her to the chair, binding her hands and feet with rope that cut into her skin. One of them started going through her things, tossing books and dishes carelessly aside. When he found her Bible, he laughed and threw it into the fire. "Won't be needing that where you're going," he sneered. Sarah kept her chin high despite the blood she could taste from her split lip. "Elias will kill you all." "Maybe," Colton agreed. "But you'll be dead first. Might have some fun with you before that, though Granger took something from me. Only fair I return the favor." The implications in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl, but she refused to show fear. "You're animals." "Yes, ma'am." Colton grinned. "That's exactly what we are." Hours passed. The men drank her coffee, ate her food, took turns watching the windows. Sarah's arms went numb from the ropes, but she kept her head up, praying silently. Not for herself, but for Elias, that he would be smart, that he wouldn't walk into this trap. Near dawn, she heard it, a sound the men missed. Focused as they were on the front approach, the creak of a board on the back porch. Her heart leaped and sank simultaneously. He'd come. Of course he'd come. And now he'd die for it. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. The back door burst open, and Elias flowed in like death itself. He fired 3 times before the shocked outlaws could react. 3 men fell, but Colton was fast, diving behind the overturned table, while the 5th man grabbed Sarah, using her as a shield. "Drop the gun! Granger!" the man holding her shouted. "Or I'll paint the walls with her brains!" Elias froze, his gray eyes locked on Sarah's. She could see him calculating, measuring angles. But the man had positioned himself well. "Let her go," Elias said, his damaged voice carrying more menace than a shout could have. "This is between us." "You killed my brother," Colton called from behind the table. "My cousins. Now I'm going to kill your woman while you watch." The man holding Sarah pressed his gun harder against her temple. She felt Elias tense, saw his finger on the trigger, but the shot, when it came, wasn't from his gun. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, smoking rifle in his hands. The man holding Sarah crumpled, his gun falling away. Elias moved instantly, putting 2 bullets in Colton before the outlaw leader could rise, then silence, broken only by Sarah's ragged breathing. "Sarah!" Jake started forward, but Elias was already there, cutting her bonds with quick, efficient movements. She fell into his arms, shaking. "You came back," she whispered. "Always," he rasped, holding her tight. Jake stood awkwardly, his rifle drooping. I heard the commotion, saw them break in. I couldn't just—" "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it despite everything. "You saved our lives." Jake's face worked through several emotions before settling on resignation. "You really love him." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "Then I wish you happiness." He turned to Elias. "Take care of her. She deserves better than this life." After Jake left and the sheriff had been roused to deal with the bodies, Sarah and Elias sat together on the porch, watching the sun rise. She was wrapped in a blanket, nestled against his side, feeling safer than she had in weeks. "No more," she said quietly. "Please, no more hunting." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, a deed, to a small ranch 3 days' ride west. "Bought it," he whispered, "with the bounty money. For us." Sarah looked up at him, hope blooming in her chest. "Really?" he nodded, touching the ring on her finger. "If you still—" "Yes," she said fiercely. "Always yes." Father Brennan married them that very afternoon. The church was nearly empty. Just Doc Hartley and, surprisingly, Jake Morrison as witnesses. But Sarah didn't care. When Elias whispered "I do" in his broken voice, when he kissed her as her husband, she felt complete in a way she hadn't since Thomas died. Different from before, scarred and hard-won, but real. That night, in the privacy of their cabin, they came together as husband and wife. Sarah had worried it would feel like a betrayal of Thomas, but it didn't. This was different, urgent and passionate where her first marriage had been sweet and gentle. Elias touched her with hands that had dealt death but were infinitely tender with her. When he whispered her name against her skin, she felt reborn. They left Dust Hollow 3 days later, Sarah on the wagon seat beside her silent husband, heading toward their new life. As the town disappeared behind them, she felt no regret, only anticipation for what lay ahead. A life carved out of violence and loss, but built on love strong enough to survive anything. The morning after the Colton gang's attack, Dust Hollow woke to a changed reality. 5 dead outlaws lay in the undertaker's shed, and the story of the night's violence spread like wildfire. Sarah stood in her damaged cabin, surveying the destruction while Elias helped board up the broken door. Sheriff Watson, despite his age and infirmities, had done his duty, taking statements and sending word to the marshal's office. But it was the town's reaction that surprised Sarah most. Mrs. Morrison arrived first, bringing fresh bread and a pot of stew. "I was wrong about him," she said simply, watching Elias work. "Jake told us everything, how Mr. Granger fought them alone, trying to save you, how he was willing to die rather than let them hurt you." Other women followed throughout the morning, even Mrs. Henley came, grudgingly offering a quilt to replace the one ruined in the fight. The men helped repair the damage, nodding respectfully to Elias, who acknowledged them with silent gratitude. Mayor Hutchins arrived at noon, clearing his throat importantly. "Mr.
Granger, Mrs. Whitlow, Mrs. Granger, the town council has met. We owe you a debt. You've rid us not just of the Colton gang, but you've shown us something about judgment and courage."
He produced an official-looking document. "We're prepared to offer a Mr. B. Granger a position, deputy sheriff, if he'll take it. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work, and the town would sleep better knowing we had someone of his capabilities protecting us." Sarah felt Elias tense beside her. She knew what he was thinking, staying in one place, wearing a badge again, facing the memories it would bring. But before she could speak, Father Brennan stepped forward. "Before you decide," the priest said gently, "there's something else. Sarah, the school board has also met. There were some who wanted to dismiss you, but," he smiled, "it seems saving the children's lives twice over carries weight. Your position is secure, should you choose to stay." Sarah looked up at Elias, seeing the war in his eyes, safety and community against freedom and solitude. She touched his hand. "It's your choice," she said softly.
Our choice. I'll go wherever you go.
Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd then, his face grave. "Before you decide, Granger, you should know. I sent a telegram to Denver about the Colton gang. The marshal's response just came." He handed over the yellow paper. "You're cleared of any wrongdoing, and there's more. They're offering you a federal position. Deputy U.E. Marshal, if you want it. Based here, but with authority throughout the territory." Sarah read the telegram over Elias's shoulder, her heart racing. This was more than they dared hope. Legitimacy, purpose, a chance to use his skills for law rather than vengeance. Elias looked at her, a question in his eyes. She knew he was thinking of the ranch he'd bought, their plans for a quiet life away from violence. But she also saw something else, a spark of the man he'd been before tragedy broke him. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his damaged voice came soft but clear. "Want to be the man. You deserve the man our children deserve. Our children." The words sent a thrill through her. They hadn't spoken of it, but the possibility hung between them like a promise. "Then be that man," she said. "Whether that's here with a badge or on a ranch with cattle. Just be the man I fell in love with." Elias turned to Mayor Hutchins and, slowly, nodded. The crowd erupted in celebration. Men slapped Elias on the back. Women hugged Sarah. Plans were made. A proper swearing-in ceremony. A house closer to town since theirs was damaged. A welcome dinner at the church. But it was Father Brennan who gave them the greatest gift. As the crowd dispersed, he drew them aside. "I've been thinking," he said, "about judgment and mercy, about the paths God sets before us. Sarah, when you first brought Mr. Granger to your door, I feared for your soul. I see now that God works in ways we don't always understand." He produced a small leather journal. "This was your husband's. Sarah. Thomas gave it to me before he died. Asked me to hold it until you were ready. I think that time is now." Sarah took the journal with trembling hands. Thomas's familiar handwriting blurred through her tears. She opened it randomly and read, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then God has called me home. Please don't mourn too long. You have too much love in your heart to waste it on grief. Find someone who makes you laugh again. Find someone who sees your strength, not just your beauty. Be happy, my love. That's all I ever wanted for you." She looked up at Elias through her tears, seeing her own emotion reflected in his eyes. "He would have liked you," she whispered. "Hope so," Elias managed, his voice rough with feeling. That afternoon, as they stood in the cemetery beside Thomas's grave, Sarah felt a sense of completion. She placed her wedding bouquet, wildflowers Elias had gathered, on the headstone. "Thank you," she said simply, "for loving me, for setting me free to love again." The wind rustled through the prairie grass, and for a moment, she could almost hear Thomas's laugh on the breeze. Then Elias's hand found hers, warm and solid and real. and she turned toward their future. The swearing-in ceremony took place at sunset. The whole town gathered as Judge Crawford, brought in specially from Denver, administered the oath. Elias stood tall in a new black suit. The deputy Ewan is, marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. His voice, though still damaged, was clear as he swore to uphold the law. Sarah watched with pride that threatened to burst from her chest. This man who'd been broken by lawlessness had chosen law. Who'd been destroyed by loss had chosen love. Who'd lived in silence now spoke his promise to protect and serve. That night, there was dancing in the church hall. Sarah whirled in Elias's arms, feeling lighter than she had in years. Around them, the townspeople celebrated not just a new lawman, but a new beginning for all of them. Even the children, who'd once whispered scary stories about the silent bounty hunter, now looked at Elias with hero worship. "Deputy Granger," little Mary Morrison tugged at his coat. "Will you teach us to shoot?" "No," Sarah said firmly, but Elias squeezed her hand. "To defend," he said carefully, each word measured. "Not attack. When older." Mary beamed and scampered off to tell her friends. Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling. "You'll have the whole town wanting lessons." "Good," Elias said. "Prepared is alive." Jake Morrison approached them near the evening's end. He'd been drinking, but not heavily. "I need to say something," he began. "I was wrong. About both of you. Sarah, you saw something in him that rest of us missed. And Granger, Elias, you're a better man than I am." He offered his hand, and Elias shook it. "Thank you," Jake continued, "for showing me what real love looks like, what courage looks like." He managed a rueful smile. "I'm leaving in the morning, heading to California. Fresh start." "Good luck," Sarah said, and meant it. As Jake walked away, Father Brennan took his place. "One more gift," he said, eyes twinkling. "The Hendersons are moving back east. Their house, the one with the blue shutters and the big oak tree, they're willing to sell for a fair price. It's yours if you want it." Sarah gasped. She'd always loved that house, with its wraparound porch and room for a garden, room for children. She looked at Elias, who was already nodding. "We'll take it," she said. Later, as they walked home through streets lit by celebratory lanterns, Sarah felt as if she were floating. From condemned woman to marshal's wife in one day, she mused. What would the gossips say? "Let them talk," Elias said, pulling her close. "I have all I need." They paused outside their damaged cabin, neither quite ready to go in and face the reminders of violence. Instead, they stood together looking up at the stars, brilliant in the clear prairie sky. "No more running," Sarah said. "No more hunting alone. We face whatever comes together." "Together," Elias agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring challenges. There would be other outlaws to face, other tests of their courage and commitment. The frontier was not a gentle place, and wearing a badge made Elias a target. But tonight, with the town's acceptance warming them and their future spread before them like an unwritten page, they had everything. As they finally went inside, Sarah caught sight of Thomas's journal on the table. She'd read more of it throughout the day, finding not jealousy or pain, but peace. Thomas had loved her enough to want her happiness, even beyond his death. And now she had Elias, who loved her enough to change his entire life for her. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now. Elias's response was in his kiss, in his tender touch, in the way he whispered her name like a prayer. And later, as they lay entwined in their marriage bed, Sarah knew that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the darkest packages. Elias had arrived bleeding and silent on her doorstep. Now he was her husband, her town's protector, her heart's home. God truly did work in mysterious ways. 1 year later, the snow fell gently on a transformed landscape. The small homestead in the valley near the Red Mountains stood like a promise fulfilled. Sturdy log walls, smoke curling from the chimney, horses grazing in the corral. Sarah stood at the window, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, watching Elias work with the children. They'd come to them gradually, these lost souls. First was Samuel, barely 10, found hiding in a burned-out wagon after bandits killed his family. Then the sisters, Emma and Rose, rescued from men who'd planned to sell them to a brothel in Denver. Young Marcus, who'd run from an abusive uncle. Annie, whose parents had died of fever on the trail. Elias had found them all during his work as a deputy marshal, and somehow, they'd ended up here. Sarah smiled, remembering how the first child had changed everything. Elias had brought Samuel home like a wounded bird, uncertain and defensive. But when the boy had whispered, "Can I stay?" Elias had looked at Sarah with such hope in his eyes that her heart had melted. Now there were 6 of them, with their own child on the way. The house rang with laughter and arguments, lessons and songs. Sarah had created a small schoolroom in what was meant to be the parlor, teaching not just letters and numbers, but hope and belonging. "Mrs. Sarah," Emma called from outside. "Mr. Elias says come see." Sarah wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The children had built a snowman family, father, mother, and 6 small figures beside them. Elias stood watching, his face softer than she'd ever imagined it could be that first night he'd collapsed at her door. "Beautiful," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Yes," he agreed, but he was looking at her, not the snow figures. His voice had healed somewhat over the year. Still rough, still careful with words, but strong enough to tell bedtime stories, to teach the boys to track, to whisper endearments in the darkness. "Letter came," he said, producing an envelope from his coat. "From Denver." Sarah recognized Father Brennan's handwriting and tore it open eagerly. The priest had become a faithful correspondent, keeping them informed of life in Dust Hollow. "My dear friends," she read aloud, "I hope this finds you well. The town prospers, and your names are still spoken with respect. Mrs. Morrison asks after the children constantly, but I write with news that may interest you. The territorial governor has announced a new program, funding for schools in remote areas, specifically for orphaned and displaced children. I immediately thought of your good work." Sarah looked up at Elias, hope blooming. "A real school, with proper supplies, maybe even another teacher to help." He nodded, thoughtful. "Would mean staying put, no more, ranging far." It was true. His work as a deputy marshal had taken him away sometimes, though never for long. And always with other lawmen now. The lone wolf had learned to run with a pack when needed. But if they established an official school, he'd need to be here more. "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked. He looked at the children, then at her belly, then into her eyes. "Want to be here, watch them, grow, all of them." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a raucous affair with 6 children all talking at once, Sarah marveled at the path that had brought them here. The widow who'd promised her heart to God had given it instead to a silent bounty hunter. The man who'd lived only for vengeance had found redemption in protecting the innocent. "Tell us again about how you met," Rose demanded, as she did at least once a week. Sarah smiled, beginning the now familiar tale, but she caught Elias's eye as she spoke, and in that glance was the truth beneath the story. How 2 broken souls had recognized each other, how love had grown in silence and shadow, how sometimes the greatest gifts came in the most unexpected packages. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Elias sat by the fire. She was knitting, badly, but determinedly, while he cleaned his rifle. The domesticity of it all still sometimes took her breath away. "Happy?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "Completely," she answered. "You?" He set aside the rifle and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa they'd bought from a traveling merchant. His hand covered hers, stopping her knitting. "Never thought," he began, then stopped, searching for words. "After Rebecca, Lucy, never thought, could feel again, love again, live again." "I know," Sarah said softly. "After Thomas, I thought my heart was buried with him. But hearts are strange things. They can break and still keep beating. They can love more than once. Differently each time, but no less truly. He pulled her close, his hand gentle on her swollen belly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for opening your door that night." "Thank you," she replied, "for crawling to it." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside and the settling of the house around them. Somewhere upstairs, one of the children coughed, and Elias tensed, ready to check on them. Sarah smiled. The dangerous man who'd once lived only to hunt and kill now lost sleep over childhood sniffles. "The school," she said eventually. "We should write back, yes. Already decided? Haven't you?" He chuckled, a sound she treasured. "Yes, but wanted. You to choose. We choose together," she reminded him. "Always together." A cry from upstairs interrupted them. Annie, with one of her nightmares about the fever that had taken her parents. Elias rose immediately, but Sarah caught his hand. "I love watching you with them," she said. "You're so gentle, so patient. You're going to be a wonderful father to this one, too." His eyes softened. "Learn from good teacher." As he headed upstairs to comfort Annie, Sarah remained by the fire, her hand on her belly. She thought of Dust Hollow, of the scandals she'd caused, the whispers and judgments. All of it had led here, to this cabin full of love and second chances. She thought, too, of Thomas, hoping he could see her now, see the family she'd built from ashes and determination, and Rebecca and Lucy, Elias's first loves, whose memory had driven him through darkness and back to light. "You don't belong to the church," she murmured to her unborn child, echoing words Elias had said to her once. "You belong here. You belong to us, to all of us." The next morning brought clear skies and new possibilities. Elias and the older boys worked on expanding the barn while Sarah taught lessons. Emma and Rose helped prepare lunch, their chatter bright as bird song. The house hummed with purpose and belonging. A rider appeared near noon, another deputy marshal, bringing news of outlaws spotted near the pass. Sarah saw Elias tense, duty calling. But the other man shook his head. "Marshal says you're to stay put. Granger, we've got it handled." He said, and I quote, "That man's done enough. Let him raise his family in peace." Relief and gratitude warred in Elias's eyes. He'd served well this past year, helped bring law to lawless places, but everyone could see where his heart truly lay. That evening, as Sarah helped serve dinner, she felt the first flutter of movement in her belly. She gasped, and Elias was beside her instantly. "The baby," she whispered. I felt, "Oh, there it is again." Wonder transformed his weathered features as he placed his hand where hers guided. They stood frozen, waiting. And then, there, a tiny kick against their joined hands. Proof of the life they'd created, the future they were building. The children gathered around, excited and curious. Samuel, the oldest and most serious, said quietly, "We're really a family, aren't we? All of us?" "Yes," Sarah said, tears blurring her vision. "We really are." As the sun set over their valley, painting the snow-covered mountains crimson, Sarah knew that every choice, every sorrow, every moment of pain and joy had led to this. The widowed schoolmarm who'd promised her heart to God had found heaven in the arms of a silent bounty hunter, and together, they'd built something neither had dared dream of, a home. Elias caught her eye across the crowded table, and in his gaze was everything his voice had once been unable to say. Love, gratitude, promise, forever. She smiled back, her hand resting where their child grew, surrounded by the laughter of the children they'd saved. This was their Wild West love story, not ending with a sunset ride into the unknown, but beginning each day anew with the sunrise over the mountains, in a cabin filled with hope and healing and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this story from. Are you by a cozy fire, on your commute, or perhaps under the stars like those that watched over Sarah and Elias? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of the frontier, and share your thoughts about Sarah and Elias's journey in the comments below. Until we meet again around the campfire, partners,